So when Sue and I were writing Zoopolis, our basic idea was that we've had 40 years of an animal rights movement, which people often date to the publication of Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. And in one sense, the movement has been a success in that there's much more public awareness of animal issues, and surveys show that people are more concerned today than 40 years ago about animal welfare. But on the other hand, if you actually look at the numbers, things are much worse for animals today than 40 years ago. There are way more animals being raised and killed for human benefit today than 40 years ago. And all the projections are that there's going to be even more animals raised and killed for human benefit 20 years from now or 40 years from now.
Bonjour tout le monde, donc moi je suis là pour faire la traduction. L'idée est née suite au constat que malgré 40 années maintenant de mouvements pour le droit des animaux qui sont basés largement sur le travail de Peter Singer, les mentalités ont commencé à évoluer dans le bon sens, mais malheureusement les chiffres montrent que dans tout ce qui est exploitation animale, les choses ont malgré tout empiré, les chiffres sont de plus en plus élevés.
And there have been some successes. So most recently, there's been a clear move against the use of wild animals in circuses. This is something that we've been fighting in Canada, and I know that is part of the work that Amandine and Philippe are doing. So that's a victory. The fight against the use of captive wild animals in circuses. But on the other hand, people are every day inventing new ways to instrumentalize animals. So if you think about things like biotechnology, they are, every day people are inventing new ways to treat animals as resources that were unimaginable 20 or 40 years ago.
Okay, il y a eu des évolutions positives, notamment par rapport aux animaux sauvages. L'exemple le plus parlant étant les cirques. Il y a des mouvements au Canada comme en France contre l'utilisation d'animaux sauvages dans les cirques. Donc c'est une avancée positive. Malgré tout, on invente régulièrement de nouveaux moyens pour maltraiter les animaux, notamment avec la biotechnologie. Donc les animaux sont aujourd'hui exploités dans des manières qu'on ne pensait même pas imaginables il n'y a pas si longtemps.
So at best, we're treading water over the past 40 years, and at worst, I think we're losing the fight. So I think we need new strategies, new concepts, new arguments, and so so Zoopolis was intended to be part of that, trying to think of new strategies to move the debate forward, and so. One of those new strategies. This is not going to be a magic solution. But one possibility for a new way forward is to shift the focus. Traditional animal rights arguments and advocacy has focused almost exclusively on prohibitions, on what we must not do to animals. We must not experiment on them, we must not eat them, confine them. But animal rights theorists have said much less about how we ought to relate to animals. What kinds of relationships should we have with animals?
L'évolution des droits des animaux pour le moment stagne, voire empire. Donc il est important de trouver une nouvelle méthode, une nouvelle approche pour faire avancer les droits des animaux. C'est de là qu'est née l'idée pour Zoopolis. Jusqu'à maintenant, tous les arguments pour faire avancer la cause ont été des interdictions, ce qu'il ne fallait pas faire, comment ne pas traiter les animaux. Donc Zoopolis peut changer cette vision-là et offrir une nouvelle perspective sur la question du droit des animaux.
So our hope was to present, to try to inspire people by focusing not just on the cruelties and the injustices, but on what we hope to be an appealing vision of just relationships with animals. And then if we ask, how should we relate to animals? It seems clear to us that there's no one relationship that's going to be appropriate for all animals, that different relationships are appropriate for different kinds of animals. And so one way to think about that is to think about the difference between dogs and wolves. So as you all know, dogs are domesticated wolves. So in terms of their basic biology, in terms of their sentience, in terms of their intelligence, in terms of their basic biological capacities, dogs and wolves are virtually identical.
Donc il faut une nouvelle approche plus positive de nos contacts avec les animaux. Et le constat est que tous les animaux ne peuvent pas être traités de la même manière, on ne peut pas avoir la même relation avec tous les animaux. L'exemple le plus parlant étant la différence entre les loups et les chiens.
In the case of wolves, I think what justice requires basically is that we leave them alone to lead their own lives on their habitat. Whereas with the case of dogs, I think we have moral obligations to provide for them, to care for them, because they are dependent on us and their flourishing depends on their relationship with us.
Donc pour les loups, la chose juste à faire est de les laisser tranquilles, tout simplement, de les laisser vivre leur vie de leur côté, alors que pour les chiens, nous avons un devoir moral d'en prendre soin, de nous occuper d'eux.
So how do we, if that's right, that we have obligations to care for dogs that we don't have for wolves in the wild, how do we explain that? And the thought we had is that in the case of dogs, we have what domestication means is that we have taken animals out of the wild and bred them over generations to live and work alongside us. And this process of domestication, I mean, if you think about the word domestication, domestic means bringing them into the domus, in the Latin, into the home. We have taken animals and brought them into our homes, into our workplaces, to live and work alongside us. And so we have made them members of our society. I think domestication should be understood as a process of taking animals out of the wild and incorporating them into our society.
Donc pourquoi une telle différence? Parce que les chiens, pendant des générations, ont été élevés par l'être humain afin de les rendre le plus domestiques possible. Le terme domestique vient du terme latin domus, qui signifie maison. Donc la domestication est un processus qui consiste à prendre un animal sauvage et à le transférer dans notre maison, dans notre habitat, et afin qu'il se plie à nos règles et à nos façons de vivre.
So, what justice requires, we argue, is acknowledging this fact of membership, and then acknowledging the rights that flow from membership. So if we have brought animals into our society through domestication, it's now their society as much as ours. Domestication involves creating an interspecies society that belongs to them as much as to us.
La domestication a fait que les chiens font maintenant partie de notre société. C'est nous qui les avons intégrés là. Comme nous avons intégré les chiens à notre société, ce n'est plus notre société, mais bien une société interespèce.
I'm a political philosopher, so in political philosophy, the category we use to designate membership is citizenship. So when we acknowledge another human being as a member of our society, we do that through the category of citizenship. And so our suggestion is, at least as a first step, that we should think of domesticated animals as members of our society, which means as our co-citizens.
Les membres d'une société sont donc des citoyens. Vu qu'on nous a fait rentrer dans cette société, ils devraient avoir maintenant le statut de citoyen également.
So what would citizenship mean? So again, I hope I'm not duplicating what Philippe said, but citizenship is usually understood as a package of rights and a package of responsibilities. So, and we think that's true, that should be true in the case of domesticated animals as well. So in terms of rights, these would include not just the universal rights, like not to be killed, not to be experimented on, not to be confined, but genuinely membership rights, rights that flow from membership. And these would include, for example, public health care. So our view is that domesticated animals as members of society should have access to public health care, but also things like public services. So the police and fire services should be trained and equipped to rescue domesticated animals in cases of fire and flood. But also, it also includes labor rights. So if domesticated animals work, I'll come back to that, they should be covered by labor rights, maximum working hours, the right to safe working conditions, pensions, retirement, and so on. And then, in a sense, above all, rights to political representation. If it's their society as much as ours, then the rules that govern our shared society should be responsive to their interests as much as to ours. So there must be mechanisms to ensure that animals' interests and preferences are solicited by the political system and then represented in the political system. There must be mechanisms, political mechanisms, to ensure that decisions for our shared society are responsive to the interests of animals.
Donc, quand on parle de citoyenneté, on parle bien évidemment de droits et de devoirs. Les droits auxquels on pense pour les chiens vont plus loin, les chiens par exemple, vont plus loin que ce qu'on peut penser aux premières approches, c'est-à-dire le droit de vie, le droit de ne pas subir d'expérimentation. Il faut penser plus loin que ça, il faut penser au droit également à une couverture médicale, auquel les animaux qui sont membres de nos sociétés devraient avoir le droit. Des droits également pour les animaux qui travaillent, des droits d'un maximum d'heures par exemple, et également une représentation politique, car ils font partie de la société au même titre que nous.
On the responsibilities, so one of the distinctive features of our story, unlike most other animal rights accounts out there, is that we contemplate the possibility that there are also responsibilities that both humans and domesticated animals have about how they live together. And so, as an example, we discuss two responsibilities that domesticated animals that we share with domesticated animals. One is a duty of, if you like, sociability or civility. So basically, the idea here is we need to learn how to live together peaceably. So we need to learn to restrain any tendency to act violently towards others, to intimidate others. So just as we socialize children to learn how to interact with civility and sociability towards others, and we teach children to restrain dispositions towards violence or threat or harming others, so too we would socialize domesticated animals, as we do, to interact sociably with their fellow members.
Donc, il y a deux exemples principaux de devoirs qui seraient inclus dans cette notion. Le premier devoir serait un devoir de sociabilisation. De la même manière que les enfants sont sociabilisés afin de pouvoir s'intégrer dans la société, on leur apprend les règles de vie, on leur apprend à ne pas être agressif envers les autres. Cette notion-là devrait également s'appliquer comme c'est déjà en grande partie le cas avec certains animaux domestiqués.
And the second responsibility of citizenship is contribution. So the idea here is that society, part of what social life involves is contributing to the common good. Part of what makes a society a good society is that its members feel some sense of attachment to the society, to the other members of the society, and so actually would want to contribute to the good of society. And so I think that society actually has, so we can think of this as that every member of society has a kind of responsibility to contribute in ways that fit their interests and inclinations and capacities. But we could also think of this actually as a right of citizenship. That is, society should be organized to create opportunities for everyone to contribute in a way that suits their interests and inclinations. I think this is something that society owes to all of its members, is opportunities to contribute.
Le deuxième exemple est un devoir de contribution. Chaque membre d'une société se doit de contribuer à sa manière au bien-être global de la société et à son fonctionnement. Mais plus qu'un droit, plus qu'un devoir, on peut également voir cela comme un droit. La société se doit d'offrir l'opportunité à chacun de ses membres de contribuer de la manière qui lui semble juste et la plus appropriée en fonction de ses capacités et de ses envies.
So one of the things that we're interested in, that we've worked on since the publication of Zoopolis, we're very interested in the idea of work. So some of you may know, so Jocelyn Porchet here in France has been doing a lot of research on what kinds of work do animals find satisfying, meaningful. What kinds of work? So in the case of, with humans, work is hugely important for our sense of self-respect, for the sense of the meaningfulness of our lives. It's important that there be things we do that give meaning to our lives, and this has been central to social justice movements, is the idea of meaningful work for humans. And I think we should contemplate the possibility that the same may be true about domesticated animals, that there are forms of work that they would find meaningful and that would give them a sense of satisfaction. So this is something that Porchet has been working on here in France. We disagree strongly with her on some of her conclusions, but I think this is intellectually and politically, it's an important to think about the possibility of what kinds of cooperative activities, what kinds of contribution, what kinds of work would be valuable and meaningful for animals themselves.
Donc le travail est également une question très importante, le travail qui donne un sens à notre vie, qui nous donne un sentiment d'utilité, qui nous apporte à tous quelque chose qui enrichit nos vies. Donc cette notion est également importante pour les animaux citoyens. Donc la question qui se pose actuellement serait de trouver dans quel domaine les animaux pourraient également coopérer, également apporter leur pierre à l'édifice dans notre société. C'est une question qui se pose...
Jocelyn Porchet.
Donc c'est une question que pose Jocelyn Porchet dans son ouvrage. Donc ils ne sont pas en accord avec tout, mais la question est intéressante.
Just parenthetically, I think just yesterday I got notification that Porchet has just guest edited a special issue of a French journal on animals and work that looks actually very interesting. Yeah.
Il y a un journal qui est sorti, cet écrivain qui pose justement la question des animaux dans le travail, qui est sorti hier.
Yes.
Hier, c'est ça.
Okay, so that's the basic picture for domesticated animals. That at the moment, domesticated animals are defined as property and are viewed as a caste group that exists to serve us. And our suggestion is that's unjust. So justice requires viewing them as equal members of a shared society with the rights and responsibilities of membership, which legally is codified in citizenship. So the basic idea is we want to move domesticated animals out of the category of property and being a caste group into the status of being members with citizenship rights.
Les animaux sont vus pour le moment comme une propriété, comme une sorte de caste inférieure qui est là pour servir nos besoins et nos envies. La question primordiale est maintenant de changer le statut des animaux domestiqués afin qu'ils deviennent des membres à part entière de notre société.
Most animal species on the planet are not domesticated. So the story I've just told, it only applies to domesticated animals because domesticated animals, precisely in virtue of domestication, have this capacity for interspecies sociability, for cooperation and communication. So we know that citizenship is a cooperative relationship. It requires trust, it requires communication, It requires the ability to comply with shared norms. We know that domesticated animals have those capacities for trust, for communication, for complying with shared norms, because they could not have been domesticated otherwise. So we know that domesticated animals have the capacity to have these kinds of cooperative relationships that are required for citizenship. Whereas most wild animals do not. They instead have fight or flight responses to humans. They try to avoid us, they don't trust us, and they don't have these intersubjective relations of sociability with us.
Donc, l'exemple donné jusqu'à maintenant concerne uniquement les animaux domestiques. Leur domestication fait qu'on crée un lien de confiance avec eux, un lien de partage. Et ces animaux-là ont été domestiqués justement parce qu'ils ont cette capacité de communication et de confiance avec nous, au contraire des animaux sauvages qui, eux, n'ont pas ce désir de communication et de partage, et au contraire, lorsqu'ils croisent le chemin d'un humain, auront plutôt tendance à fuir ou à attaquer pour se défendre.
So the citizenship model, we think, is a possible approach for justice with domesticated animals, but it's not a viable model for justice with wild animals. That's just not, we're not going to have the same kind of trusting, cooperative relations with wild animals that we can have with domesticated animals. So we need a different model to achieve justice in our relations with wild animals. And for that purpose, we argue that it's useful to distinguish two big categories of wild animals, which we call wilderness, truly wild animals living in the wilderness on their own habitat, as opposed to what we call liminal animals, who are not domesticated, so they're free living, but they live amongst us. They don't live out there in their own habitat, they live amongst us. So you can think of this as urban wildlife.
Au sein des animaux non domestiqués, on peut maintenant distinguer deux grandes catégories. La catégorie des animaux vraiment sauvages qui vivent dans leur habitat à eux et qui n'ont pas d'interaction ou peu d'interaction avec l'être humain. Et les animaux liminaires qui, eux, sont bien sauvages mais qui vivent dans le même univers que nous, qui vivent au contact avec nous mais tout en restant des animaux sauvages. Il faut distinguer les deux catégories au sein des animaux non domestiques.
So let me start with the case of the truly wild animals who live on their own habitat. So, at the moment, legally speaking, they're defined as natural resources, both domestically, and they're just viewed as a resource of the state, and under international law, wildlife is considered a natural resource. And so, and we have the right to exploit that resource, which either involves hunting and killing them or colonizing their habitat and settling on it and developing it. So essentially, we have we view wilderness as a resource there to be exploited and colonized, and our suggestion is, and that's unjust. So what does justice require? Our suggestion is that we should think of wilderness animals as forming, if you like, that they are their own nations and living on their own national homelands, if you like, and that they have a right to that territory. It's their territory, not ours. And that for us to colonize their habitat is very much like colonizing the territories of indigenous peoples elsewhere in the world.
Donc les animaux sauvages, à proprement parler, ont un statut juridique de ressources naturelles pour le moment. Ce sont des ressources naturelles que nous avons légalement le droit actuellement d'exploiter, que ce soit avec la chasse ou en détruisant leur territoire. Donc ce qui est proposé, c'est de leur donner un statut de résidence sur ce territoire, au même titre que les indigènes avaient leur propre territoire, et que prendre ce territoire est aussi injuste que lorsque nous avons pris le territoire des indigènes.
So we think justice requires recognizing two core rights: a right to territory, again it's their territory, not ours, and the right to live autonomously they have the right to live freely on their territory. So, again, I'm a political philosopher, so in political philosophy, the label we use to capture these ideas of rights to territory and rights to live autonomously is the idea of sovereignty. So, as a first instance, we suggest we could view wilderness animals as having their own kind of sovereignty. The term sovereignty gives, some people find that a difficult concept. So if you don't like the word sovereignty, don't worry too much. What matters is that sovereignty is just a label for the rights to territory and the rights to live autonomously on that territory.
Donc ces animaux sauvages devraient avoir droit à deux droits fondamentaux. Le premier étant le droit du territoire, qui peut également être appelé souveraineté, même si le terme peut paraître quelque peu choquant pour certaines personnes. Peu importe le terme, l'idée la plus importante, c'est que ce territoire leur appartient et doit leur appartenir. Et également le droit de vivre de manière autonome sur ce territoire sont les bases juridiques auxquelles ils devraient avoir le droit.
So justice. So in the case of domesticated animals, justice requires moving from being a caste property to co-members. In the case of wilderness animals, it involves taking them from the category of resources to being the category of having this sovereignty over their own territory.
Donc deux éléments différents. Pour les animaux domestiques, on parle bien de devoir de citoyen, de droit de citoyen, alors que pour les animaux sauvages, la justice voudrait qu'ils soient souverains de leur propre territoire et libres de leur propre vie, toute autonomie.
Okay, then the second category of non-domesticated animals are not those who live out in the wilderness, but those who live here amongst us, which we call liminal animals. So these are pigeons, crows, mice, rats, foxes in some places, raccoons, Canada geese. I don't know what are actually I should have checked. Usually when I come give to another city and give a talk, I try to read up on what are the main types of urban wildlife, but hopefully you're...
Rats and pigeons.
Yeah, okay.
Donc la deuxième catégorie d'animaux sauvages sont les animaux liminaires. Ce sont les animaux qui sont sauvages mais qui vivent à nos côtés, qui ne vivent pas sur leur propre territoire. Ces animaux, par exemple, vont être les pigeons et les rats. Vous demandez quels animaux nous avions dans nos villes. Donc j'aurais dit principalement les pigeons et les rats, mais ça peut également être les renards dans certains endroits, les souris, tout type d'oiseaux.
At the moment, many of these liminal animals are viewed as pests. And so they are actually, in some ways, they have the least legal protection. Domesticated animals are usually covered by some kind of anti-cruelty provisions, which are very, very weak, but still there are some legal restrictions on the treatment of domesticated animals. And there are at least some kinds of protections for wilderness animals, like in some endangered species legislation. But in most countries, there's literally no restriction on how you treat pests. And they are subject to often brutal campaigns of extermination.
Les animaux liminaires donc, sont bien souvent vus comme des nuisibles. Alors que les animaux domestiques, en général, sont protégés par un minimum de lois. Les animaux sauvages, à proprement parler, également, ils ont certains droits, notamment s'ils sont des espèces protégées. Par contre, les animaux liminaires, actuellement, on peut voir pas de protection. Ils sont considérés comme des nuisibles et peuvent être exterminés, notamment par des campagnes dans les grandes villes. Ils disposent de très peu de protection actuellement.
So I think Philippe wrote something about the recent Paris extermination campaigns against rats. So we need to get so in my view that's unjust. So viewing these liminal animals as pests to be exterminated is unjust. So what does justice require? Well, it can't be treating them as sovereigns over their own territory because they're living here with us. but nor can it take the form of citizenship because they're not domesticated, so they don't have the same capacities for trusting, communicative, cooperative, sociable relations that we have with domesticated animals. So we need a different model for liminal animals. And our suggestion is that we view them as having residency rights in the city, so that we share physical space with them, but they're not, in fact, members of a shared social scheme. We don't have social cooperative relations with them. We're not part of a common scheme of social cooperation, but we share physical space with them. And so what we need to do is we need to learn how to tolerate, how to coexist with these animals who have the right to live. They have residency rights, but don't have the same kind of thick cooperative relations that we're capable of having with domesticated animals.
Donc forcément, le traitement qui est réservé aux animaux liminaires est injuste. Donc la question va donc se poser comment rétablir une justice. Les deux modèles que nous avons utilisés jusqu'à maintenant ne peuvent pas s'appliquer. On ne peut pas leur donner une souveraineté sur le territoire dans lequel ils habitent, puisque c'est un territoire que nous partageons avec eux. On ne peut pas non plus les considérer comme des animaux domestiques et donc leur donner un titre de citoyen, puisque nous n'avons pas de communication avec eux, nous n'avons pas de relation de confiance avec eux. Donc la solution proposée est une solution de résidents, comme des résidents, puisqu'ils sont également des habitants de nos villes, de nos territoires. Nous devons trouver un moyen de cohabiter avec eux et un moyen de partager ce territoire équitablement avec eux.
So we call these liminal animals, and their status would be denizenship. So denizen basically means resident. So they're not citizens of a shared cooperative scheme, but they are residents of urban space. So they're denizens, and this would be defined primarily in terms of rights of residency and rights to some kind of mutual accommodation. So we need to learn to accommodate to their presence just as they accommodate to our presence. And this involves some degree of negotiating reciprocal inconveniences and burdens. There's lots of things we do that are make life very inconvenient for them. There are things they do that make life inconvenient for us. We need to sort out some scheme of kind of mutual accommodation. So liminal animals have the status of denizenship, which we could think of as basically, as I say, residency rights and some accommodation rights.
Donc les animaux dits liminaires sont des habitants au même titre que nous, donc on peut les considérer à ce titre comme des résidents. Donc il faut trouver une solution pour pouvoir vivre en cohabitation avec eux, afin que nos nuisances ne les perturbent pas trop et inversement.
Okay, so that's the basic. That's a very crude, simple sketch of the story in Zoopolis that we need to think about. So, and just to kind of summarize the main lessons or the main claims in Zoopolis. So, the first is that we need to supplement a focus on negative prohibitions with some vision of positive relationships with animals. Secondly, that those relationships are going to be differentiated. We need to think that different kinds of animals, we're going to have different kinds of relationships with different kinds of animals. Thirdly, that in thinking about these differentiated relationships, we need to ask what kinds of relationships animals want to have with us. So, in thinking about what justice requires going forward, we need to ask what kinds of relationships do animals want to have with us? You might think that's obvious, but it's actually surprisingly rare that animal rights theorists have asked that question. What kinds of relationships do animals want to have with us? And I think if we ask that question, we will get differentiated answers. Some animals, wilderness animals paradigmatically, are going to want to have nothing to do with us. They want to be as far away as possible from us. Every human intervention in their territory they find as a disturbance. as a threat. There are other animals, these liminal animals, who actually like being around us, not because of intersubjective relations, not because they become our friends or companions or co-workers, but they do like human habitat because it may provide food or it may protect them from predators. And then there are other animals, domesticated animals, who actually, there's reason to believe, can flourish precisely in interspecies relationships. Just as one source of human flourishing is our interaction with domesticated animals, so there's good reason to believe that domesticated animals, one source of their flourishing can be their interaction with us, if we define those terms appropriately.
C'est un résumé rapide du livre Zoopolis, auquel il faut retenir 3 points. Le premier point est donc de changer notre vision par rapport à la question du droit d'animal. Pour le moment, on est très porté sur les interdictions, ce qu'il ne faut pas faire. Il propose une vision plus positive pour apporter des droits positifs aux animaux. Le deuxième point est donc de faire une distinction entre les 3 catégories animales, domestiques, sauvages et liminaires. Et le troisième point est de se poser la question de ce que les animaux veulent, ce qu'ils attendent. Là encore, il faut bien faire une distinction dans les 3 catégories. Les animaux sauvages vont avoir tendance à ne vouloir aucun contact avec nous, à vouloir aller le plus loin possible de nous, alors que les animaux liminaires, eux, se portent plutôt bien à notre contact. Ils aiment vivre dans les mêmes villes que nous, dans les mêmes lieux que nous, parce qu'ils en tirent un bénéfice, notamment au niveau de la nourriture. Et pour finir, les animaux domestiques, eux, semblent également tirer quelque chose de positif de la relation à l'être humain, de la même manière que nous tirons quelque chose de positif de la relation en général aux animaux domestiques.
So we offer this as a starting point, and on our view, the success of this model would depend on whether it in fact is responsive to the wishes and preferences and interests of animals themselves. So our hope is, our proposal is, that thinking of domesticated animals as citizens would require us, it's part of the very definition of citizenship, that it would require us to be attentive to their interests and preferences. And that if we think about wilderness animals as sovereign, then that would require that any intervention we make, like in the habitat of wilderness animals, would have to be consistent with their territorial rights and their autonomy rights, and that the terms of denizenship for liminal animals would be responsive to the kinds of... So, I mean, basically all 3 of these categories are meant to... some people worry about our story. We've had this reaction many times, that we're imposing a human category on animals, that these are human categories of citizenship, sovereignty, and denizenship, and isn't this just yet another way in which we're imposing our categories on them? And our response is that it's part of the nature of these categories that it forces us to be responsive to their wishes. So if there's any value to this approach, that's its value, is that these categories work in such a way as to force us to be attentive to what kinds of relationships animals want to have with us. So it's, in a way, it's meant to be the kind of opposite. The point is not to impose yet another human scheme on animals. The point is, how do we force ourselves to be responsive to them? And that each of these categories is meant to track what kinds of relationships animals want to have with us.
Donc certaines personnes auraient tendance à penser que le fait de mettre les animaux dans 3 catégories comme ça est encore un moyen d'imposer la vision humaine aux animaux, puisque c'est nous qui décidons dans quelle catégorie chaque animal se situe, alors que bien au contraire, le but de mettre les animaux dans chaque catégorie est de nous forcer, nous, humains, à prendre compte de leurs besoins primordiaux. Par exemple, pour les animaux sauvages, la moindre intervention de notre part devrait tenir compte de ce fait, de leurs besoins, de ce qu'eux veulent et ce dont ils ont besoin principalement, notamment la protection de leur territoire et de leur autonomie.
So that's basically the story in Zoopolis, and we hope that it captures some important dimensions of justice in our relation. We hope that it identifies, it helps us see some of the forms of injustice that we currently perpetrate on animals, and some avenues for justice towards animals. But I should also say that there is a strategic rationale. I mean, it's primarily a philosophical theory to be evaluated for its merits as an account of justice. But we also hope that it has a political payoff, which is that it would enable us to see more connections between the animal rights movement and other social justice movements.
Il espère également que le livre aura une retombée politique, que les droits des animaux seront également pris en compte au même titre que les droits d'autres individus actuellement. Et en plus de la question juridique posée par le livre, il y a donc une double partie politique.
I don't know the situation in France as well as I should, but in North America, the animal rights movement has been described as the orphans of the left, which is a very interesting phrase. So, social justice movements, it's part of the ethos of social justice movements in North America, but I'm sure it's here too, to express solidarity with other social justice movements. And so it's part of it's just part of what it is to be on the left and to be a social justice person. That if, maybe your primary focus is on the rights of immigrants and refugees, but you express solidarity with the rights of indigenous peoples, or the rights of sexual minorities, or the rights of people with disabilities. And so that's just part of the living ethos of the left today, is solidarity with other social justice movements. But the big exception is the animal rights movement, at least in North America. The feminist movement has never expressed any sympathy for animal rights. The anti-racist movement in North America has not expressed sympathy for animal rights. The sexual minority, gay rights, has not expressed any sympathy. The disability rights movement has not expressed any sympathy. You can look at the websites of the main advocacy organizations for any of these groups, and they will. So, if you just call up the website for leading anti-racist advocacy organizations or sexual minority organizations, and their website will very clearly state that they express solidarity with feminists, with immigrants, with indigenous people, they will say nothing about animals.
Le mouvement social pour les droits des animaux est une exception malheureusement actuellement, dans le sens où les différents mouvements sociaux qui existent pour les droits des gays, les droits des minorités sexuelles, et les mouvements féministes, tous les mouvements sociaux qui expressent en général une solidarité envers les autres mouvements. Par exemple, si on va sur la page de certains de ces mouvements, il est clairement indiqué que ce mouvement est solidaire des autres mouvements sociaux, à l'exception systématiquement du mouvement pour les droits des animaux actuellement.
So that's why they're called the orphans of the left. They have either been expelled from the family of social justice movements, or they have seceded. But whatever the explanation, the animal rights is outside of the family of social justice movements. And I think this is fatal for the animal rights movement in North America. We have no hope of success if we are orphans from the broader family of social justice movements.
Donc à cause de ça, le mouvement des droits des animaux est appelé le mouvement orphelin de gauche. Et c'est quelque chose de dramatique actuellement, parce que tant que ce mouvement sera seul et désolidarisé des autres mouvements sociaux, il ne pourra pas avancer correctement.
So there's a lot of complicated reasons for why animal rights are orphans of the left, which we can talk about. I'm very happy to talk about in question period. But one problem is that many people on the left just don't see any connection between, so there's a lot of talk about intersectionality in the left, about interlocking oppressions and so on, but people just don't see the animal question as connected to, related to, intertwined with other forms of oppression. And I think one of the reasons for that, again, there's lots of reasons, but one reason for that is that the face of animal rights has been these negative prohibitions, no positive image of justice. So that people can't see any connection between so other social justice movements are about things like membership. They're about things like representation, and they're about things like meaningful work. I could go through a whole long list of what are some of the core ingredients of social justice, and those have not been part of the animal rights lexicon.
Donc la question qui se pose, c'est pourquoi le mouvement droits des animaux est exclu de tous les autres mouvements sociaux. Il y a plusieurs raisons possibles à ça. Et la raison avancée principale est justement le fait que la question des droits des animaux est toujours vue d'une façon négative. On parle d'interdiction, on ne parle de rien de positif, alors que les autres mouvements sociaux, eux, proposent d'appartenir à ce mouvement, d'en être membre, proposent des choses positives également.
And a particular problem in North America, it may not be as strong here, is that one of the most visible and influential versions of animal rights advocacy are the group called abolitionists, but which more specifically are extinctionists. So this is a position associated with Gary Francione and others. Their view is that there is no possibility of just relations with domesticated animals. For Francione, there is no possibility of having just relations with domesticated animals. And so we need to render them extinct. So that is the goal. I don't know how strong that movement is here in France, but in North America it's very strong in the animal rights movement, that the goal should be to render domesticated animals extinct. And that, we can argue, again, I'm happy to answer questions about why I think that's a misguided position philosophically, but I think politically it's a catastrophe, because it makes it impossible to understand any possible connection between animal rights and any other social justice movement. I mean, could you imagine any other social justice movement saying that what justice requires is the extinction of indigenous peoples or immigrants or people with disabilities? So I think if we want to be part of a family of social justice movements, we need a story about what justice requires with respect to domesticated animals.
L'un des problèmes également est que le mouvement le plus représenté, notamment en Amérique du Nord, est le mouvement abolitionniste actuellement pour les droits des animaux, qui préconise l'interdiction complète d'avoir des animaux domestiques. Donc ce qui apporte une image négative également et qui n'existe pas dans les autres mouvements sociaux. L'exemple donné étant si le mouvement pour les droits des indigènes proposait l'interdiction des indigènes et l'abolition de leur existence. Donc forcément, c'est pas une idée qui est retrouvée dans les autres mouvements sociaux et qui fait que le mouvement pour les droits des animaux est exclu actuellement.
So in and I'm going to stop here, but so in some of our more recent work, Sue and I have been interested in trying to push our story forward about justice with domesticated animals. And so one of our articles that came out after Zoopolis looks at farmed animal sanctuaries as sites for experiments of just relations with domesticated animals. And so, there are many people, and who really, their view is, well, how to put this? We've been so brainwashed to think that cows and pigs and sheep, that they're just food animals, and that we cannot, that if we didn't eat them, we'd have no reason to have them in our world. I can't tell you how many people I've heard say that. That if we stopped eating them, why would we have them around? So we're interested in farmed animal sanctuaries, which are a huge movement in North America. Again, I don't know how much this is happening in France. Every day there's a new farmed animal sanctuary opening in North America. It's a real phenomenon. And they're partly just offering refuge to animals that have been abused in the factory farm system. So they're partly just a place of refuge. But the more interesting ones from our point of view are actually experiments in living, in creating an interspecies society built on the idea of membership, that we're all members of a shared society, and then using this space of a farmed animal sanctuary to explore what kinds of social relations do sheep and pigs and cows and chickens want to have with each other? What kinds of relationships do they want to have with us? What kinds of work, if any, do they show interest in? What kinds of work do they clearly want to avoid? And so that this is on our view, it's one of the few places in our society where we can actually look for experiments in creating this model of citizenship for domesticated animals.
Les auteurs de Zoopolis ont écrit récemment un article qui traite des sanctuaires pour animaux de ferme. Ces sanctuaires sont de plus en plus nombreux en Amérique du Nord et il en faut quasiment tous les jours. La plupart des sanctuaires vont uniquement offrir un refuge aux animaux, mais pour certains, c'est une expérimentation en quelque sorte de l'idée qui est proposée dans Zoopolis. C'est une façon de voir quelles interactions les différentes espèces, les cochons, les vaches, les oies, les canards vont avoir entre eux, mais également quelles relations ils veulent avoir à l'être humain, s'il y a des travaux qu'ils veulent faire, qui semblent les intéresser, si au contraire il y a des tâches ou des travaux qu'ils ne veulent en aucun cas faire. Tous ces centres, tous ces refuges pour animaux de ferme sont un très bon exemple et une très bonne expérimentation de l'idée qui est proposée dans le terme Zoopolis. Et par ailleurs, une question qui revient souvent, une remarque qui revient souvent, est que si on n'avait plus de ferme pour les animaux, ces espèces-là n'auraient plus de raison d'être et disparaîtraient. Donc c'est une idée forcément qui est contrée par l'exemple donné dans ces refuges.
So I think that's it, and I'm happy to take questions.